Russia's military modernisation programmes are very much in the news at the moment. There's been a lot of attention to some of the things that Russia has been doing, for instance, in the Baltics or around the Black Sea. And there is a major NATO conference coming up later this year in Poland. So this is something that we decided we were going to take a look at our Ashdown's intelligence review. Again, this was an area where we could bring a wide range of capabilities to bear. So one of the first things we did was talk to our colleagues in the Jane's Defence Budget team to get a sense of the amount of money that Russia is ploughing into its military. And I think if you look at the figures, the interesting thing there is that at a time when the Russian economy is really suffering, not least because of the decline in the oil price, Russia has managed to protect the amount of money that it is putting into the military. And this is really having an impact in terms of the development and modernisation of its forces. The second thing we did was talk to our colleagues on the military capabilities desk to get an idea of essentially what Russia is spending this money on. And we were able to supplement this with analysis conducted using satellite imagery, whereby we were able to look at some examples of that modernisation taking place on the ground. So ranging from the deployment of new submarines in Murmansk in the north, down through to eventually the deployment of advanced ground-to-air missile systems in places like Syria. So we were able to get a real picture of what that military modernisation programme was buying for Russia. Lastly, we reached out to well-known external contributors to get a sense of some of the political dynamics underlying this programme. And I think if you read the article we produced on this, one of the really interesting things is that for President Putin in Russia, this programme is important because it allows him greater strategic flexibility in his foreign policy, because he has a more powerful tool behind it in the form of the Russian military. Now, other parts of other people in the Kremlin are interested in supporting the military-industrial complex. There are people who are interested in increasing Russia's ability to defend itself. But the assessment from our expert contributors was that for Putin, this is about his influence abroad. And once you start conceptualizing the Russian military modernization program in that way, then you begin to draw some conclusions about what that means for Russia and for its neighbors. Once you have this idea that the reason they're developing their military is so they can use it as a tool of foreign policy, you can begin to take a look at how the situation is likely to evolve in the future. So what we did was conducted an analysis of all of Russia's neighbours, its environs, and tried to work out the places where either existing conflicts could escalate in the future, or places at the moment where there isn't a deployment of the Russian military where there might be in the future. And there are a couple of interesting conclusions out of that. One is that the Baltics, which is an area where at the moment there is a lot of attention on the potential for a Russian threat, are actually a relatively low level of threat compared to some other areas. It would be a huge step for Putin to commit military forces into that area. And in terms of his goal, again, of influencing his neighbours and organisations like NATO, the trade-off is not going to necessarily go in his favour. Similarly, we're unlikely to see another Syria-type deployment. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that there isn't really another country like Syria where the conditions exist for a Russian intervention of the kind that we saw. But secondly, and this is something we really dig into in the article, that Russia's strategic capability, its ability to project power into Syria, has been severely tested. We analysed, for instance, the way in which Russia is using civilian cargo ships to move some of its key material into Syria because it simply doesn't have the strategic sea lift capability that it needs to support that. In contrast, there are a number of areas where there is a relatively higher risk of a future Russian military intervention. Now, some of this is in areas where there are currently frozen conflicts, so places like Ukraine, places perhaps where Russia has intervened in the past, so Georgia, and also there are a number of states in Central Asia where, given the future political direction of those countries and their leadership, and also the potential, of course, for the spread of jihadist insurgency from places like Afghanistan, there is again the potential that Russia might seek to intervene at some point in the future, very much in line with that strategy of supporting its overall foreign policy objectives. And another thing we were able to look at by bringing in external experts and analysis of the development of Russia's strategic forces was the attitude that Moscow and its military have towards the use of nuclear weapons. Now, at a time when countries like the US, for instance, are doing everything they can to downplay the role of the nuclear option in their military planning, the same cannot be said for Russia. Low-yield tactical type weapons are built into a lot of their doctrines. They're also investing in the development of a variety of different methods of deploying nuclear weapons in ways that would defeat, for instance, ballistic missile defense systems. So at a time when, for its neighbors, there is a growing attempt to limit the role that nuclear weapons play in conflict, for Russia they're becoming a more accepted part of their strategy. And this doesn't necessarily mean that we're likely to see the deployment of these nuclear weapons, but that shift in the attitude and in the doctrine is something that definitely has an impact on the calculations that Russia's neighbours and organisations like NATO will make in the future. I think it's the old adage that when you have a hammer, every problem begins to look like a nail. The more Russia spends on its military, the more resources it's devoting away from other parts of its economy, the more it has to justify that investment. Similarly, if you are using your military as a coercive tool of foreign policy, which is what we think Putin is doing, then you're inevitably going to accrue costs in terms of your diplomatic relations with your neighbours. You're going to lose what an international relations theorist would call soft power. So by relying on the military, you in effect force yourself to rely on the military more in future. And that's important because it locks you into that spending at a time when the Russian economy is really suffering. And also, the more you're deploying your military abroad, the greater the risk there is of an unintentional escalation, so something going wrong, leading to a broader conflict, which again is absolutely something that Russia isn't looking for. And there is also the possibility of defeat. I mean, the current leadership in the Kremlin will have memories of the last time the Soviets deployed themselves in Afghanistan. That's still a very tender memory for a lot of them. And they are aware of the risk as they continue to pursue this strategy of greater foreign policy of assertiveness, supported by the threat of military action, or in many cases actual military action, that every time they are sending their troops into harm's way, there is a risk that the situation will not play out the way they envisage, and that could have potentially significant consequences, not only in the foreign policy sphere, but also for Russia domestically.